Dr. Nancy Olivieri is another study in scientific courage. She's a blood specialist at Sick Kids. This is a name you probably know because her saga played itself out in the newspapers for, well, endlessly. Her story has to do with the fact that she reported favorably some preliminary results for a drug that it was hoped would help with a hereditary blood disease called thalassemia major. The drug's name was deferiprone, D-E-F-E-R-I-P-R-O-N-E. And the long and the short of it is she reported some early results that were favorable, and sometime later, some 3 years later, changed her mind, decided that there were concerns about the safety of the drug. And she wanted to report on this, and that got her into a serious mess, which involved Dr. Olivieri, her hospital, and the drug company which had been funding her research. Where's Nancy?
Thank you. I guess some of you may have heard a little bit about what happened to me in the newspaper, but as Michael Bate outlined just a little earlier, that probably wasn't totally accurate. And I'm sort of reminded of what George Carlin said when he said, honesty is the best policy, but apparently by elimination, dishonesty is the second best policy. And some people don't mind coming in second. So what you remember from my story may be a great deal of detail that wasn't true. What I do when I'm not writing briefs for my 17 lawyers is I look after children with a disease called thalassemia and patients with sickle cell anemia, and both those are diseases that are fatal blood diseases and more commonly found in the developing world. They're orphan diseases in the United States and Canada, but 1 in 7 of the world's population carries a gene for either sickle cell disease or thalassemia. So contrary to what you read, those aren't rare diseases, and they represent a huge market in emerging countries. And so what I've thought about little else for the past 5 years is what happened and why it happened at the University of Toronto, and whether it could happen again, and what this really means. And I was at the NIH last week, and my mentor, David Nathan, said to me, the whole problem with what happened is that patients will never trust doctors the way things are going. And I think that's right, and that's what I want to talk about today is how it's a story for all Canadians. It's a story for doctors, but it's also a story for all of you, because if you don't recognize it, we're all going to need new drugs in the next 30 years. We're all going to die of something that might be helped by a new drug. And I think there are several levels where we can't trust. We can't trust our government, and we can't trust our universities. And that's due in large part to the inappropriate influences of corporate interests on university research. Note that I said inappropriate. Another thing that has been said is that I'm a completely anti-corporate individual, and I recognize that there are needs to use corporate interests in research. 90% of phase 3 drug trials are funded through companies, but that alone should make us worry. And when I say inappropriate uses, I really want to point out that these concerns, I didn't dream them up. I may be an expert witness to them, but I didn't dream them up. They were talked about 60 years ago when Harold Innis said to us that to buy universities is to destroy them, and with them the civilization for which they stand. And in the last 12 years, we've had many Canadian panels, most notably the panel on commercialization of university research, tell us that in addition to teaching, research, and community service, the usual triumvirate of university duties, one must add a fourth, and that's innovation. Only the panel on research defined innovation as the process of bringing goods and services to market. And they recommended that university professors be hired and promoted and tenured on the ability of them to keep pace with industry and to negotiate contracts with industry and to run successful studies based on what industry is interested in. And if this doesn't worry you, it should. And there are a number of practical reasons why it should worry us. And the first is that if drug companies fund, and I should say they fund a great deal of Canadian research, as you've heard from Joseph. Most of my funding comes from the United States, as does clearly his. The inappropriate commercialization of university research defines the questions that are asked. So you have to ask yourself, who funds the diseases like malaria or schistosomiasis, for which there isn't a market that's really readily available? People in Sri Lanka and India aren't paying for that kind of thing because that's not a profitable disease. So that doesn't get a lot of funding. So the questions that are asked are defined if we inappropriately commercialize university research. But as we've seen, probably more importantly, the answers that we get are defined with the inappropriate influence of corporations on university research. And I'm an example of that. I now am, fortunately I don't have this kind of money, but I have had 2 $10 million lawsuits that are active against me because of the opinion I issued on a drug on which I'm an expert. So it doesn't encourage us to stand up and say, I think I'm going to report negative data when these occur. The next reason that one should be all concerned about the commercialization or the inappropriate commercialization of university research is because of the recommendations of the scientific panels of the last 12 years. We're going to define who asks and answers those questions. And it's going to be doctors who are industry friendly, doctors who will turn a very soft eye to adverse effects. If I sit with my patients and tell them there's something wrong, they possibly can believe me, but we've seen many, many times the results of publications that usually set out to prove the opposite and find that 96% of researchers who are forming a public and strong written opinion about a drug, this in case a cardiac drug, a heart drug, had links to the company. Now, there's nothing wrong with corporate links, but how many of those people declared those links? Exactly 3% of people writing favorable articles about these drugs declared their links, their benefits, their consulting arrangements to the companies. So you've got to ask yourself, why didn't they declare them if conflict of interest didn't affect that? That's the problem. So it's not just that the universities are looking, the deans are friendly. The university presidents, our president, Robert Pritchard, campaigned Jean Chrétien to relax the restrictions on generic drug companies at a time when the primary generic drug company was suing his professors for millions and millions of dollars because of a donation that would have been, because it was reneged upon, the largest to the University of Toronto in the history of the university. These are conflicts of interest that are obvious, and they occur when corporate, when interests drive research. Now, research by definition, alone among social institutions, the university should stand for truth. That is its only function. And it isn't there to make money. It isn't there to be friendly to the health protection branch if it's being friendly to drug companies. It's there to provide truth. And corporate-driven science isn't truth. It's directed, it's politically and economically driven. And the most important thing is it's secretive. And that's not what science is about. Science is an open provision of knowledge for its own sake. And that's what academic freedom is about. Academic freedom is the right to criticize business and not, as we've seen, be fired for it many times. I can hear in the audience, as I've read many times in certain newspapers in this country, that drug companies need to protect their interests because they take so many risks in bringing drugs to market. Well, I think that the pharmaceutical industry is an enormously privileged industry, and I think it has responsibilities other than to its shareholders. And, well, let's just look at the risks that drug companies run. Let's look at the 1999 figures in the US for pharmaceutical companies. They, on average, received a return on revenues of 19%, which is first of all industries in the United States. Commercial banking was second at 16%, and other industries range from 0.5 to 12%. So to quote Marcia Angel from the New England Journal of Medicine, an industry that surpasses all its research and development costs, as well as every other industry in the United States, simply cannot be considered too risky. It's not true that drug companies are taking terrible risks. The risks taken are those of the frontline people, and that's you. Many people here must be in drug trials. I hope you know that your physician, that she or he does not have a conflict of interest with that drug company, because the literature tells us that that enormously affects doctors as well as university deans and university presidents. And that's been an enormously complicated story that really hasn't gotten out, because in terms of corporations, and I include the Hospital for Sick Children's Administration and the University of Toronto's in this, there's a classic approach, which is, we've termed it the 4 Ds: deny, delay, divide, discredit, and they added dismiss. And that's a kind of a classic approach to deception in this, and that is probably what you may have read about. But the real issue isn't Apotex, the real issue isn't me, or whether I was fired 6 times or 10 times. The real issue is when you sit down with a patient, you have to be able to disclose exactly what you're afraid of, whether you're wrong or whether you're right. And that's called the precautionary principle. It's stated everywhere. Well, it's stated in several documents everywhere. It's stated in the Nuremberg Code and the Doctrine of Helsinki, and it's stated in the Hippocratic Oath. And we who conduct studies in children, in my view, have a special duty to that oath. And that's what the whole story was about. And some people say, one of my friends said, the facts of this case and its ethical implications are so straightforward as to be almost uninteresting. And they really are. They're so straightforward it wouldn't make a single line in the Globe and Mail if the university had understood that what's really at stake is disclosure. And so I think in many ways, physicians are responsible for the positions we get into, signing contracts with drug companies that look lucrative and look good. But it's the public's responsibility. It's your responsibility. You are the shareholders of the non-corporate sponsored industries that keep drug testing alive in this country. And if you decide that that's not important to you, we'll see more tragedies. We'll see more patients dropping dead of inadequately disclosed adverse effects from drugs. And we're going to see that. So I would just implore you to listen to the real story and to remember we founded an organization called Doctors for Research Integrity. And my favorite quote always was that from Dante, who, when he said, the hottest places in hell are reserved for those who in times of great moral crisis maintain their neutrality. So I'd ask you not to be neutral on this subject. It's one that affects all Canadians and one that we can all help to prevent in the future. Thank you.